We're glad everybody could join us today. Of course, before we start off, just remind everybody, I don't think anybody needs to be reminded that it is 9/11. What happened that fateful day some years ago. So I'm glad everybody could come for this, which is really an appropriate topic to talk about on 9/11, and perhaps even more so after the President's speech last night, because drones, or as our Air Force brethren would say, unmanned aerial systems or remotely piloted vehicles. And when I grew up in the military, drones were something you shot at as a target, but it's become the common term. So we've got three very distinguished professors, members of the Security Studies program faculty, to talk about their experience, their thinking, and they have thought a lot and written a lot of controversial things, and I expect that they'll say some controversial things. As you can see, we are filming this today. We will we'll put this on the Security Studies YouTube page for all your colleagues who could not be here, or so you can refer to this in the future, because I think that we'll very likely have some very important insights here shared with us today. So Professor Byman will start, and then Professor Fair, and then Professor Swift, and we will and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Dave mentioned the 9/11 context, and drones, or armed drones, I should say, really started to interest me in that context when I was doing 9/11 investigation. The question people were wondering about at the time was, why hadn't the United States killed bin Laden before 9/11? And there were a couple answers to this. One was, couldn't find him. Knew he was in Afghanistan, and it was hard to find. The other was, occasionally we thought we knew where he was. But that wasn't really the question. The real question was, where would he be when the munition hit the target? And if you're talking about cruise missiles, that's several hours in advance to put in charge. And that's a very different intelligence requirement. It means, do you know for sure the target is not going to decide to go out for a smoke break? It's very safe in the United States, but in general, that the target's going to stay put. And related to that is, what is going to be the collateral damage? And when you're talking about human beings, again, that's very difficult because you don't know what's going to go in and out of the strike zone. Drones solved a lot of this because it enabled immediate strike, and in particular persistence, the idea that you could be above a target, surveilling it for some time, determine who's in the blast zone, and in the end use a relatively small munition compared to other systems to strike. So drones, I think, understandably became a weapon in this counterterrorism war. Very briefly, I want to dispel what I feel are some myths, and then give, I'll say, a largely 70% pro-drone talk. One myth is simply how we use drones. If we are talking about governed areas, so let's say Belgium, let's say Singapore, let's say Morocco. If there is a suspected terrorist, we call up the government in question and have them arrested. Okay, we don't use drones. Right? So this whole kind of, will we drone someone in Europe? No, we don't do that. Related, we don't drone enemy governments. Okay, there is a small but significant Al-Qaeda presence in Iran. Okay, I don't want to be the bogeyman here, but there is some there. And we don't do drone attacks in Iran because A, it would be an act of war, and B, they would probably get shot down anyway. So it would be a stupid act of war. So where do we use drones? We use drones in conjunction with allies with weak governments, where they don't control their own territory. And that's a very narrow set of cases around the world. And I think people often miss that basic issue. So why am I pro-drone? The obvious point is, if used in a sustained way, and I'll stress the word sustained, drones can remove terrorist leaders, facilitators, logisticians, and you can go pretty deep down in the bench and really make it hard for them to function as an organization. They can't replace lost leaders at a rapid pace. For any of you who have been in a bureaucracy and your boss is transferring and new boss is coming in, you know that for 2 months kind of nothing gets done. Right? Imagine this is happening all the time. It's very, very hard to do effective operations. Also, the drones enable the United States to act where they otherwise might not, because the pilot is going to survive. Right? That you can take risks with the platform that you wouldn't take in a variety of other capacities. But a big benefit of drones, and to me one that's most ignored, is that it forces the adversary to adapt in a very costly way. To avoid drones, they have to be careful about talking on the phone, they can't gather in large groups. In general, their command and control systems are turned against them. If they want to exercise command, they're vulnerable to drones. So they decentralize, they don't have regular communication, on and on and on. And you can survive the drone war if you do that. You're just much less effective. And we have a lot of cases from Al-Qaeda's own documents where they're saying, we're not in touch with our affiliates. Well, part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason for that is because of drones. Okay, disadvantages. Drones kill innocent people. They do. I'm up here with Christine Fair. Usually I steal her work completely on this, so I'm still going to punt that off to her. But I will say they obviously do kill innocent people. The caveat I would make is compared to what? So if you're comparing it to fixed-wing aircraft with a large ammunition that doesn't have persistence, then drones are actually much more, if you want to use the word, humane, or I would say discriminate is probably the best word. And so, ironically, I actually always saw drones as being on the side of more discriminating targeting, even though inevitably, when you're talking about munitions and you're talking about intelligence in dangerous areas, you're going to make mistakes and people are going to die. Second disadvantage, allied publics hate them. That's largely true, from what I can tell. There's a lot of variance on this, and again, I'm going to punt over to Christine on this, but in some countries, especially Yemen, there's a real resistance, and the bigger thing is, it makes them think less of their own government. It shows that their own government has to rely on outsiders for their own security. Now, their own governments, I would say, are probably disliked or loathed or despised for a dozen reasons, and I would be skeptical that drones were particularly high on the list, but it's certainly part of the problem. A big problem, though, that we can actually do something about is the relative lack of oversight and transparency in the drone program. This program started out in a clandestine way. It's always better for politicians to not be revealing details on a day-to-day basis, right? So every politician comes in thinking he or she is going to change that, but they say, but not today. You know, we don't need to have this controversy today. But the result is there's a lot of bad information out there about drones. And it's hard for people like me who believe that, in general, these are good things to defend because the data are skewed. And so I think a lot of this should be out there. I think a lot of this should be out there for the public debate to make it more sustainable. There's a disadvantage I will discuss that I actually find rather less convincing, which is the idea of precedent. Right? That if the United States does this, everyone else will do it. A few things. Folks, don't confuse drones with a targeted killing program. Okay, you can kill people in lots of different ways, and drones are simply one of them. So I think the precedent issue people are concerned about is not drones, but a targeted killing program. But the other goes back to my first one, which is where do we use this? We use this in ungoverned spaces, right? So it's not talking about we're going to slide this one into Belgium and blast someone there. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about using it with the cooperation, for the most part, of the governments in question. And so when we're talking about precedent, we have to think other countries would need basing, they would need local support. They would need a lot of things that I actually think we have. Our problem is we don't do a very good job publicizing what goes into this. And as a result, people get scared of the precedent because they don't realize how the United States actually uses it. I'll end simply by saying there are good reasons to be critical of drones, but the alternatives to them, to me, are much more troubling. One, as I mentioned, is fixed-wing aircraft, usually with larger munitions, much more likely to cause civilian casualties and less effective. Another is you could ask allies to do counterinsurgency operations on their own. If you've ever studied for a minute the counterinsurgency doctrine of Yemen or Pakistan, it largely involves surrounding the village and blowing it to smithereens with artillery. That's not the most discriminant means of... I'm sorry, and F-16s, I stand corrected. In general, this is not a population-friendly form of counterinsurgency, shall we say. Another is to go after long-term causes. As a terrorism scholar, I've actually become quite skeptical of this. It sounds good, but I don't really know what those are. This is a small group phenomenon, and we don't have a particularly good sense of what causes individuals to do this. There are individual, if you will, jihads and causes that motivate people, but it's not some broader factor like education or poverty, and in fact, those seem to correlate negatively. That if you make the world richer and if you make the world better educated, you may actually see a spike in terrorism, at least in the short term. the real actual, to me, alternative is inaction. And sometimes that's appropriate, right? I don't think the United States needs to go after every target, and we can talk some of the specifics we've gone after. At times I feel the U.S. has been too broad in what it's been targeting. So I do think not acting is a realistic alternative to using drones as a target killing campaign. I would just say that it should be not acting sometimes, rather than not acting all the time. And when you are acting, drones frequently can be a very good choice. So let me pass things off to, I think, Christine.
By the way, there's 2 more chairs over here, if y'all don't want to stand. All right, you want to escape. Keep your options open. All right, so unlike Dan and unlike Christopher, I have no general expertise. I study one region of the world, and that's it. I study South Asia. So I'm not going to be able to speak to drones in Yemen or drones over Belgium or any place like that. I'm going to really focus my remarks upon the one country that I know regrettably well, perhaps regrettably too well, and that's going to be Pakistan. So for some of you, this might be, I see a couple folks over in my South Asia class, so this might be a little bit of a rewind and play for those of you who remember this thing called a tape recorder. But the first time we actually had a drone strike in Pakistan was in 2004, and that was to kill Naik Mohammed, I think arguably one of the most attractive jihadis that I have seen in Pakistan. Naik Mohammed, a jihadi, if you will. Those of you who follow my Twitter feed, you will know I have looked at many jihadis. But Naik Mohammed was many things, including an attractive man and a murderous thug, but he actually wasn't Al-Qaeda. And so our very first drone strike in Pakistan was not against an Al-Qaeda member. Why did we kill Naik Mohammed? Well, Naik Mohammed actually embarrassed the Pakistan army. After a number of peace deals, he embarrassed the Pakistan army by kind of doing a victory lap around the army. And the one thing you can't do in Pakistan, and you want to stay alive for very long, is embarrass the Pakistan army. That's the one thing that will get a drone on you, is piss off or embarrass the Pakistan army. And that's exactly what Naik Mohammed did. So that is his nickname amongst my South Asian girlfriends. We call him Naked Mohammed. I'm so sorry. Don't know Gretchen Peters. She has a serious thing for him. She was very sad and he got whacked. Anyway, so to Gretchen Peters, one for you, one for my homies. So anyway, so from the beginning of the drone program in Pakistan, we began to see this tension between what the authorized use for military force of 2000 said we could kill people for and what we were actually doing. And this tension between who are we killing and with what authorization persists to date, more or less. So why did we do what eventually became, what is called a goodwill kill? So in exchange for killing this fellow, we've become quite an embarrassment for the Pakistan Army. The Pakistan Army was going to give us access to this flight box over the federally administered tribal areas. And for those of you who know anything about Pakistan, this geographical restriction was actually really important. It wasn't just a coincidence. It turns out that a colonial era legal regime persists called the FCR, the Frontier Crimes Regulation. And what this means is that Pakistanis who have no affiliation, tribal affiliation, cannot simply go there. So this would be as if the United States has discovered that Indiana and Kentucky are so dangerous and so lawless that you can't go there unless you happen to have family ties to that region. And so this subsequently means, just by virtue of being born in Vanna or Miramshah, as opposed to your relatives who are born in Karachi, you essentially have different rights. You don't have access to courts, you don't have access to police. And this is going to be very important to all the drone haters who say, well, why can't you just arrest them? Well, there are no police in FATA, for one thing. What you have are lushkars, and lushkars, I think, are the closest thing to American speak to a posse. And you have this thing called a basically you have an administrator for each of the agencies, and he services pretty much all functions of rule of law. So he is the policeman, he's the judge, he's the juror. And when he, and it is a he, the political agent makes a decision, you have no appellate mechanism, right? This also means that you don't have the apparatus of the state functioning, and I'm not going to say that Pakistan has great governance outside of FATA, but just imagine how much worse it is in FATA if you imagine what governance looks like in the rest of Pakistan. So this basically means that FATA is a land of impunity. And one thing that's sort of interesting, most of the drone folks don't realize, again, going to the point that Dan said, is compared to what? Collective punishment is allowed in FATA. So for example, if your nephew or your uncle or your brother is a miscreant in Pakistan parlance, the political agent has deemed that you need to hand him over, and they'll send up a tribal lashkar, posse, they'll even have a jirga stamp this ruling. If you don't hand this miscreant over, not only can they seize all of your commercial property, so if you happen to be a peach seller, if you happen to have peach orchards, they can seize all of your produce, they can bulldoze your house, and they can destroy your orchards. So again, compared to what? Not only are we looking at very devastating Pakistani military operations, by the way, if you're looking at the current operations in North Waziristan, which I call Operation Bakwas, or Operation Nonsense, you have to really ask what's being gained from this. They gave the actual militants 5 months notice to flee, so any jihadi worth his knockoff Chinese sneakers has already absconded to kill us in Afghanistan, leaving behind the dumb and dumber who are actually going to take on the Pakistani forces. And the devastation has been significant, substantial. About 1 million people have been displaced. There have been no significant displacements caused by the drone program. So you first have to start with this comparison of compared to what. And I want to echo Dan's point. There is another alternative, and that's doing nothing. And this is where, as an American, I get very conflicted. Because in the last several years, the majority of the people that we've been killing with drones in Pakistan do not, contrary to what the administration, I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to put that out there. I'm not an Obama hater, generally. We've been mostly killing Pakistani terrorists who actually don't pose a real threat to us. And this is a puzzling thing, right? If ever there were to be some sort of congressional hearing, it's possible that many of these drone pilots and their commanders, and we can sort of, Christopher can probably address the who's responsible for violating our law, right? Because we're not killing folks consonant with what a sane person would interpret is being permitted by the AUMF. So for me, the irony is that we're basically killing Pakistan's bad guys. And because of the way this deal was hatched with the Pakistanis in the first instance, it had to be a covert program, meaning there could never be any recognition. I mean, President Obama can joke about the drones, sending them to kill the Jonas brothers if they flirt with his daughters, but he can't talk about any particular drone strike or its outcome. And so, I mean, this is incredibly puzzling, and it's incredibly frustrating. And the intent, of course, the first views or the first instincts of the drone haters is to blame the U.S. and we're this vast secrecy state and trying to trample everyone's rights and this is all extrajudicial killing, blah, 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 blah. The fact is, it can't come forward because of the Pakistanis. As Dan said, many of the people in the countries where drones operate are very sensitive to the fact that their own government can't take out their jihadis. And this is certainly the case in Pakistan. And the Army has a lot of source of criticism in the country. And this idea that the one institution that says we can best protect you, and that's why we get to run and ruin the country whenever we feel like it, and yet we have to bring the American kuffar with their drones. Obviously this doesn't play very well. And so if we were to ever bring the Pakistanis out of the closet, it would be very doubtful that the program could even continue. So what's the cost of inaction? To us, especially when we're out of Afghanistan, at first blush it looks like there's no cost of inaction. But depending upon the numbers, if you buy the Pakistani inflated numbers, and I don't, they put forward a number, and it's like a magical number, it just comes out of anywhere, like this magical number generator. And on any given day, it inflates by 5,000, randomly. They'll say about 50,000 people have been killed since 9/11. According to databases that I've looked at, it's closer to like 7,000. But that's a lot of people, right? That's already more than 2 times the number of people that died in the 9/11 attacks. So the irony is that we're, in some sense, providing security to the Pakistanis, right? Because we're not really directly experiencing a benefit. All the folks running this program might be severely violating our own law, and yet we get all the heat for it. And this is why I get very frustrated, and I'm going to turn very briefly, because I think going through this exercise is kind of important, in part because the work is so horrible, and it is directly proportional to the horribleness of the work, is the attention that this report got. And that is, and I'm going to take this one apart, but I could do this with any number of other reports, because that's what I do. I'm a Libra, and I'm a velociraptor. So, it's on my students, you guys said that I made you do calisthenics for not reading 400 pages.
I didn't say that.
I heard. It came back to me. Someone has bad OPSI. But anyway, I'm going to take apart the NYU Stanford report only because it was so egregious and so poorly constructed. And actually, I got kicked off from Al Jazeera for being impolite to its authors. I don't know how that happened. Let me tell you a little bit about this report. So obviously, it, like many other reports, they're up in a swivet over the allegations of civilian casualties. They very rarely pose the question, yeah, of course civilians are being killed. Ilyas Kashmiri was killed twice. I know because I had a party celebrating his demise twice. So what happened to the first killing of Ilyas Kashmiri? Who was killed then? We'll never know, right? So I'm not going to discount the claims of civilian casualties, but I'm going to discount how they're understood and how they're processed, and how too much credulity, I think, is given in evaluating these reports. So the NYU Stanford report was actually commissioned by an anti-drone organization called Reprieve. And when I said this on Al Jazeera, the host said, "Where did you get this information?" It's called a Roman numeral 1 of the report, which I think you didn't read. And that was in fact the case. So if you were to pick up a report that validates the health benefits of smoking, and it was paid for by a lobby dedicated to promoting smoking, you would immediately have your BS detectors on. Like, well, oh my God, this has to be garbage, right? But for some reason, when we move to the human rights field, the fact that these are human rights advocates, oh, human rights are do-gooders, so therefore there can't be anything wrong with their explicit advocacy. Well, I mean, I'm a do-gooder too, right? But when do-gooders don't do good, then I have a problem. And in this case, I think they've done a lot of things wrong. So the first thing that they did was that they had this study commissioned by an organization that had a clearly anti-drone bias. Now, to their credit, they don't hide this. To this, I have to blame everyone that's read it without, any truckloads of salt. I have to blame those folks. So they do admit it, admittedly, on Roman numeral 1. They then interview 139 people. None of these people are from Waziristan. All of those interviews were facilitated by Reprieve, which is a four-noted drone-hating organization. The lawyer is widely reputed to be on ISI's payroll. In fact, I understand from our journalists that we didn't give him a visa when he tried to come here because of his ISI stink. So finally, the State Department caught on to that fellow. But that's fine. They selected all of their folks on the basis of their dependent variable, i.e. we all hate drones. If you want to do good research, of course, that would be fine. They claim that they tried to validate that these people were who they said they were. Now, anyone who's been to Pakistan will tell you, I could go and get a death certificate for myself, and I could present it to Dan Byman and say, can you please give my husband my life insurance benefits list? Here's my death certificate. So when I pointed out to Reprieve that you didn't actually prove that any of these people were ever alive, much less dead, the author of the report virtually stabbed me with whatever was available. He thought this was the cruelest thing ever, to expect the victims to prove that they were in fact victims. I said, well, actually, that happens all the time. I can't simply say I'm dead, pay my husband my life insurance benefit, but somehow they get away with this in this context. The other thing that, and this report is not the only one that does it, in fact, they all do it. They love to show photographs of crumpled metal. And we're told that this is the remnants of missiles. Now, it may very well be the remnant of a missile, but what have they not proven? That it was a remnant of a drone strike, an F-16 strike, and if you look at the places where drone strikes happen, they happen because terrorists live there. And what goes on? Terrorists are also bombed by the Pakistan Army if they're the wrong terrorists. If they're not bombing the terrorists we want them to bomb. They're bombing the terrorists that they want to bomb. So you have basically, and by the way, we don't even know if the pictures are taken from Waziristan. Right? So what we're basically told is, oh, here's a picture. It's from a drone strike. Believe us. But there's no evidence provided other than the picture itself. One of my favorites are the pictures of injured children, because nothing will make a human rights organization go crazier than a picture of an injured child with an eye missing or a leg missing. And it is also well known, because it turns out that there are drone advocates in Pakistan, I'm going to talk about in a minute, who said, these people were not even anywhere near a drone strike. This was due to a car accident. This was due to, some kid falling off of a horse. I mean, there are any number of things, but they were not caused by drones. So this is also very frustrating. And one of the chief witnesses of a drone strike that was brought to testify here before the United States was 11. And this isn't used as extensively in this report as it was by the report by Human Rights Watch, children were giving witnesses about the distance of a drone strike to like the centimeter. Now, when I was 9, I couldn't tell 10 to 100 feet would not be something that would have been my cognitive skills. So really just taking whatever they were told without any criticism or doubt whatsoever, meanwhile discounting everything that they've been told by US officials. I just think that's disingenuous. Rarely do these human rights organizations bother knowing anything about the technology. So in a Human Rights Watch report that came out last summer, much was made about a child, again I think he was 11, Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, the details, or maybe Dave can. The child, and he was a key witness, and explaining how his grandmother was decimated and incinerated by a drone, talked about drones flying in parallel. Well, drones, especially at that time, did not have that capability. And because this Human Rights Watch didn't even bother meeting with people who are experts on aviation, that just went by without note. They will frequently disagree on the village where the drone strike took place that killed grandmother, or even about the crop being planted. One account said Granny was planting soybeans, the other account says she was planting corn. Well, I'm from the Midwest, I know the difference, and I would expect someone whose granny was planting one of these things to also know the difference. And so this is very frustrating, and this brings me to, I think, a larger critique of the human rights folks, is that they view people like you and me as foes, not collaborators. They seem to think that we want to obfuscate the truth, and therefore, when they find details like drones flying in tandem, they have no interest in knowing that that's rubbish, right? So they actually are excluding all of us from this debate because they presume that we are trying to assert our agenda. And in fact, I think we all have an interest in knowing who's actually being killed and with what effect, right? I will say, as a critic, I'm not the ant culture of drones, as Abdul says I am. I have a problem with the fact that it's completely covert, although I understand the reasons why, right? In Afghanistan and Iraq, when we kill civilians, we can acknowledge it and we can make reparations. We have no ability to do this because of the constraints of the program, but the constraints are not entirely due to us. So can you do this work better? I mean, I think this is the question that everyone who's wrestling with it is trying to answer. I think you can do it better than these human rights organizations have done. And I do want to give them credit, right? They're operating in a low quality information environment with governments, both the American and the Pakistani, that want to obfuscate their findings. The Pakistan Taliban and Al Qaeda want to obfuscate their findings. I do this in my methods class. I want you to imagine if you are living in Miramshah and some dude knocks on your door. Hi, I would like to ask you your opinion about the drone program. What are you thinking? Is this an ISI guy? Is this a Pak Talib? Is this an Al Qaeda operator? Is it some crazy Malvi that is interested in social science all of a sudden? Is it the CIA? What do you do when someone asks you this question, right? I do survey work in Pakistan. I have to think about this all the time. I'm going to put my human hat on, and I'm going to ask, how am I going to answer this question? So can you do it better? Well, you can't. Sebastian Abbott did it, and he didn't have the resources of Human Rights Watch. What he had was a bunch of stringers. By a bunch of stringers, I mean 4. And he went to one of the sites in North Waziristan that turns out to be studied by the Stanford NYU report, and he did something really innovative. He asked the people who prepared the bodies, right? Islam, like Christianity, like Judaism, privileges burying bodies, except for those of us that want to get burnt and have our husband turn our ashes into diamonds he can then use subsequently for his engagement ring for his new wife. That's in my will. Jackass even in death. But so he talks to people that prepared the bodies, right? Because it's expensive to bury people. You just don't make an empty grave and put some dirt there. So the bottom line is, according to Sebastian Abbott, when he went and investigated this one particular drone-affected area, 75%, his interlocutor said about 75% of the people were actually combatants, and they would call combatants. By the way, their definition of combatants might be very different from ours. And that number was low because there was one drone strike that we all know about in Dr. Kale where a bunch of folks were killed, many of whom were probably civilians. When you took that out of his calculations, 90% were militants. So when NYU, the authors of it, said, well, we can't go into Waziristan. Well, actually, that's not true because I know Sebastian Abbott's team did. You just didn't try. So that's the first thing you can do. You can actually go to the place where the thing takes place and talk to people who have intimate knowledge of who the people were that were claimed to be. The second thing that they can do is they can actually talk to avionics experts. We actually have a lot of people. I own stock in firms that make drones. So this is big business. So this idea that, you know, this is scary stuff and no one in the Air Force will talk to us or the CIA, we don't have to do that. Talk to people who write about this for a living, right? The other thing I would say to these advocacy-based groups is pair up with a social scientist, right? They're not your enemy. We all want to know the same answers to the same questions. And quite frankly, human rights organizations usually have the resources to do it, and real researchers don't, because you think DOS is going to give us a grant to go investigate this. And then finally, I'm going to put the onus on the Pakistanis. There's this really good functioning outfit in Afghanistan called the Civilian Casualties Unit from it's a part of the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan. UNAMA has an office in Pakistan. What do these folks do that others don't? They go to the site of where the event occurred. They talk to civilians. They talk to just about anyone they can. They give NATO, they give the ANSF a chance to respond. And what they publish is an account with inputs from all these different entities. You know, if the US, NATO, or ANSF says, sorry, we're not going to comment, well, that's our problem, right? And they publish this. So if the Pakistanis are as outraged as they say, and I don't think they really are, they should be completely willing to being more transparent and opening up this region to the kind of work that UNAMA's Civ Cas unit has been doing since 2002. All right, thank you very much.
Coffee up with me, and those of you who suffered through my law of war class know that with coffee in hand I can go for hours. I'm going to do what entertaining professors try to do, which is to start with an anecdote, then jump directly into criticism, and then follow up with a theoretical framework. The anecdote really pings off something Chris was saying just a minute or so ago, which is if you want to understand this issue, if you want to understand it from a social, political, or even economic perspective, you really have to go to where the problem is. So 2 years ago, while I was working on a chapter for my forthcoming book, I decided I was going to go to southern Yemen, and I was going to dig in as deep as I possibly could on how Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula and its various allies interact with the various tribal groups in the south, and with the various other political actors that sort of stir the pot in Yemen on a, well, I'd say daily basis, but these days it's more like hourly. So I went to southern Yemen, and before I left, friends of mine in the human rights community said, well, Swift, you're a human rights lawyer, you know, why don't you find out all about the droning? And friends of mine in the national security community said, well, Swift, you're a PhD in international politics, why don't you find out all about the droning? And I thought, okay, well, I'll ask a few questions, you know, of my cohort of individuals about, you know, what's going on with the drone program here, what the local view of it is, what the level of efficacy is, are they hitting the right people, are they hitting the wrong people, and sort of what's the mood on the street. Well, when I got there, I expected to hear, because I'd read it in the New York Times and the Washington Post and a number of other outlets, that the drone program was very effective in Yemen in terms of targeting high-value assets in AQAP, but that local backlash because of civilian casualties was essentially creating a recruiting loop that allowed Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and its proxy Ansar al-Sharia to sort of increase the size of their own forces and, you know, capitalize on the resentment of the Yemeni population. And that's very much the view I heard when I spoke to English-speaking Yemenis in the capital, Sana'a. When I got down into the no man's land between where the Yemeni army was starting its counteroffensive against Al-Qaeda and where Al-Qaeda actually had its safe havens at Jar and Jinjabar, I had a very, very different view. The first thing I'd hear from the local sheikhs was how much they hated America, all of the bad things America had ever done in the Middle East, how they didn't trust the fact that America was supporting the government in Sana'a, something that Daniel referenced earlier. And then they'd say desperately how much they needed more drone strikes because Al-Qaeda was taking their kids. That's not what I expected to hear. That was really not what I expected to hear. And when I came back, I wrote an article about, wow, this is a huge difference between what is being said in Washington and what I heard from sheikhs who are fighting Al-Qaeda door to door in their own villages in southern Yemen. Right? Not sheikhs who are on the side of the government either. And that discontinuity, was framed up and packaged in an article for Foreign Affairs. And the title I put on the top of the article was Yemen's Drone Dilemma. Well, about 24 hours later, Foreign Affairs publishes it with The Drone Blowback Fallacy. That's the title. And about 24 hours after that, the hate mail started. Suffice to say, if you read beyond the title of that article, and you sort of dug into the data that I was trying to develop, you run into two very complicated issues. The first is law, and the second is strategy. And much of the debate we're having in Washington, and much of the debate we have had at the highest level of government and the highest levels of media, the human rights community, the legal community, and others, has really been about how we feel about the drone program, or about the drone program's function as a proxy for how we feel about the global war on terror. So if you're in Code Pink and you're innately suspicious of all activities involving the global war on terror, drones are always going to be bad, right? And if you're writing for the Long War Journal and you're innately, suspicious of anything involving Islamic militancy, drones are going to seem a whole lot more reasonable. And somewhere between these two extremes, we actually have a conversation that's not happening. And that's the conversation about the relationship between law, policy, and strategy. And so what I'd like to do is sort of take apart some of these tropes a little bit, and then try to give you, as students and practitioners, a framework for thinking through these issues, hopefully without giving away too many of my own biases. The first trope is that drones are good. Right? Drones allow us to engage in targeted operations against discrete individuals with low cost and limited risk. Right? Light footprint approach. And you can understand in the wake of Afghanistan and Iraq why that would be an appealing option from both a strategic and an operational standpoint. The difficulty is that we're not always engaged in targeted killings. Sometimes we're using drones as a replacement for an air force, and what we're actually doing is hollowing out the middle management in a terrorist organization. Because when you hollow out the middle management, it suddenly becomes very hard for the senior leadership and the foot soldiers to communicate with one another. If you want to precipitate organizational collapse, from an operational standpoint, that's one of the fastest ways to do it. This is what we did in Pakistan, and what we've started to do in Yemen over the last few years. The second trope, of course, is that drones are bad, that they are engaged in indiscriminate killing of civilians. And that's something you hear very strongly from the human rights community. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. If somebody would please get me good data, I'd be thrilled. And the third is that drones are a sign of the impending apocalypse. And this is the notion that the technology is going to decide for us, that the technology is going to eclipse somehow human decision-making, right? Human beings' ability to decide when and how and why they use violence. Well, speaking as an international lawyer and speaking as somebody who studied strategy in Cambridge, it doesn't matter whether it's a drone we're talking about or whether it's a xylophone. If you kill someone with a drone or you kill someone with a xylophone, the same law applies. And why does the same law apply? Because the law and customs of war don't care about the instrument or the platform or the technology. They care about the violence. And if you look at the relationship between law and policy, it also, if you read your Clausewitz, it also cares very much about the violence, not the instrumentality, not the vector, but the effect that violence has on your ability to control, shape, or change a political and social environment. So when we think about drones, we have to stop thinking about the drone. Indeed, when we think about drone warfare, we have to think not about the drone part of it, but about the warfare part of it. And to the extent that you've seen criticism of drone policy creeping into the mainstream in Washington, D.C. over the last couple of years, it's accompanied the realization that what we're doing when we use these instruments is engaging in war. And previously that wasn't as clear as it probably should have been to some people. So how do we understand where and when and whether we can even engage in this kind of warfare? Right? Whether we can use violence against these targets in these kinds of theaters. Well, there are three questions everyone should ask, and I'm going to scope out that framework I mentioned earlier. The first question, and I prioritize it because I'm a lawyer, is it legal? The second question is it effective? And the third question is it wise? And those of you who've taken my Law of War in the Age of Terror class will suffer for the next few minutes. But let me explain what I mean by each one of those, right? You can have something that's completely effective and completely wise, but at the same time be entirely illegal. You can have something that's legal and effective and still unwise. You can have something that's legal and wise and completely ineffective. What does that mean? It means we have to do with drone warfare what we do with every other kind of war. Align our ends, ways, and means such that these things are serving our interests and not our misperception of the reality in somebody else's country. So is it legal? Well, on the international side, there are two questions to ask. Right? The first is a jus ad bellum question. Can I start a war? Can I go into this country? The second is a jus in bello question. Jus ad bellum is the sovereignty question. Can I intervene in somebody else's country? As a general rule, the answer is no, unless they ask for your help, in which case it's not a sovereignty violation. Part of the reason that President Obama referenced Yemen and Somalia last night, but didn't reference Pakistan, is because the Yemeni and Somali governments have asked the United States to come in and help them through the use of drones and through special forces and other mechanisms to help with their internal insecurity problems. The reason he didn't mention Pakistan is because Pakistan plays both sides of that. Right? They'll criticize U.S. drone policy in public while faxing us the kill list on a weekly basis when relations are good. It's my understanding that when Pakistani-American relations are bad, it goes down from once a week to only once in 7 days. The second question we need to ask as Americans, or at least in terms of American policy, is it legal under U.S. constitutional law? And the first question there is really the question of authority. Who has the authority to engage in this kind of operation? Well, generally speaking, if Congress and the President are on the same side with something, and Congress has passed a resolution or a statute or something else authorizing something, say like the authorization for the use of military force, the President has a lot of leeway in terms of what he can do under domestic law. Doesn't mean that everything's fine from an international law perspective, but it's still one of the boxes you have to check in asking the question, is it legal? The second question, the question that's really been quite interesting and has dominated debates inside the United States, is the whole Fifth Amendment question. Now, a lot of you, when you think of the Fifth Amendment, think, oh, I'm going to take the Fifth. They can't make me testify. In some cases, they can indeed make you testify. But the more important issue with the Fifth Amendment is what's called the Takings Clause. Can you, an American citizen or a person subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, be deprived of your life, liberty, or property without due process of law? And when we talk about the DOJ targeted killings memorandum, when we talk about the whole question of whether you can drone someone like Anwar al-Awlaki, what we're really talking about is that Fifth Amendment question. And from a U.S. legal perspective, it's a very important question. I'm not quite sure the DOJ has done a great job of reconciling it with their memo, but that's, again, one of the 4 boxes we need to check off before we know whether an operation, at least an operation in a case of targeting U.S. Citizens, would be legal. And the second question is efficacy. Is the operation effective? And there's 2 ways to look at that. The first is, did you hit your target? And Dan has done a good job of describing how we can reduce the costs and reduce the risks while increasing efficiency and increasing the likelihood of a successful mission using these kinds of platforms. Right? That's one of the benefits of the technology, but it still doesn't go to the whole question of efficacy. Because efficacy is not just about operations. It's not just about putting warheads on foreheads. It's also about whether your use of violence against that target in that particular theater serves your ultimate strategic ends. The problem in Yemen that I discovered was not that drones were recruiting for Al-Qaeda. Drones were doing a pretty good job of keeping Al-Qaeda in the box. The problem was that the perception of U.S. intervention in another Arab country was being used by spoilers in the political process to disrupt the political transition that the Saudis, the GCC, the EU, and the United States were trying to put forward. Right? It wasn't a direct effect. It was an indirect effect. And it wasn't the effect that people were discussing inside the Beltway here. So operationally, things were working fine, notwithstanding the unfortunate civilian casualties that cropped up from time to time. But strategically, you had, the military operations and the diplomatic operations not well synced up, or not as well synced up as they could have been. And the debate we were having in Washington about drones good, drones bad, did very little to help reconcile that tension between our diplomatic and military operations in that particular country. I should also note that a lot of these questions of efficacy turn on the value and quality of our intelligence. That's especially important in an area where we don't have boots on the ground, where we're relying on local governments or local proxies or local allies or people on God knows what payroll to tell us where the bad guys are. I can tell you that in the parts of Yemen that I was in, they hadn't seen an American who wasn't a journalist, I don't know, in a decade, maybe longer. Right? I can tell you that when I was in Yemen, the folks that we had on the ground who were supposed to be engaging the security services would go down the street in Sana'a to have another indoor closed-door meeting with their counterparts in the security services. They weren't out talking to the local tribesmen who had the intelligence, the relationship, and a whole lot of skin in the game. So if we're going to be engaged in these operations, we may be doing it at lower risk and lower cost and at a distance, but that doesn't mean we can do the intel by remote control. In order for there to be high degree of efficacy and a low instance of collateral damage, we've got to have better intel, and better intel means building and maintaining relationships with locals, not just building and maintaining relationships with the security services who speak English in national capitals. Finally, I want to touch very briefly on the whole question of whether something is wise, and I can't tell you whether something is wise because it's really a case-by-case analysis, or in the law we call it a fact-specific determination. But I can give you a couple questions that will help scope that out in terms of your own thinking. The first is, do we really want to be carrying water for some of our purported allies? Do we really want to be engaging in goodwill kills on behalf of the Pakistanis or maybe the Yemenis? Or do we want to be focusing on the people who threaten us? That's kind of a rhetorical question. I'd much rather us focus on those that threaten us and that we have clear legal guidelines and parameters, perhaps under a revised AUMF, that spells that out so we know where the reasonable limits are. Second, we really need to consider whether our actions create unmanageable consequences. Right? Not just this week or next month or next year, but whether our actions will upset an equilibrium in a place such that we're not going to be able to manage that equilibrium in a favorable, constructive manner down the road. Now, I don't think that's the case in Yemen and Pakistan, or much less Somalia, because each one of these places has enough of its own endogenous problems that our intervention really is, inconsequential. Right? But it is important in places like Iraq and Syria where we're going to have a lot more influence and where we're essentially going to be standing up and supporting people fighting locally. And the third question is, do our actions now make it more difficult to achieve our fundamental security objectives in the future? That's a corollary of the last question. You've always got to be thinking not just about the urgent now, not just about what's trending on Twitter or what's on the cable news tonight, but what's going to be on the cable news 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. That's the difference between being operationally focused and being strategically focused. And again, speaking as a lawyer, I see the law not as a speed bump in that process, but as something that makes you slow down and think about how best to plan for the future rather than just react to the present. I want to conclude today with a brief discussion of one last trope, and it's the trope that you see most common in the media and most common in our public debates about drones, drone warfare, and the war on terrorism generally. And that is this notion that there's a fundamental tension between liberty and security. That somehow liberty and security exist on a sliding scale and it's a zero-sum game and you have to gain security by reducing liberty or gain liberty by reducing security. I would respectfully suggest that that's a false dichotomy, especially for a constitutional republic. You can't have liberty unless you can secure it. And no security is worth having unless it's free. So when we think about liberty and security, we need to start thinking in our public discussions about absolute gains, not relative gains, about how we secure both in a way that enriches the two. And the only way I know how to reconcile that is to be sure that we are good stewards of the law, internationally and constitutionally, and that we also distinguish operations from strategy. Thank you.
All right. Well, I hope I kept my promise that we would hear some very controversial remarks. So at this time, we've got about 30 minutes, so we will take questions and have a discussion.
Can you up slightly? One of the advantages of being at Georgetown is not only do you, I hope we have very good faculty, but we also have a number of people in our student body who know a tremendous amount about much of what we do. We have in the audience actually Major Dave Blair, who's not only flown, I'm going to say drone and watch him turn purple, not only flies drones, but has also been an AC-130 pilot, so really understands multiple dimensions. Dave, if there's a minute or two, is there anything you'd want to pick up on that or disagree with what was said, just to hear your thoughts on this?
I think I would just echo, and of course, when I'm saying this, I'm speaking as an academic researcher, not as a member of the military. But I think I would echo the focus on policy rather than the focus on technology. The technology does matter in some very specific questions, but it's generally not the questions that are being raised in the policy arena. And that from the perspective of military professionals, that having flown both aircraft, I think that our approach to my approach to both aircraft is really the same. Is that we execute national policy, we follow the appropriate laws and the orders over us, and we take our duties very seriously. So,
Questions? Yes.
My question is about after U.S. forces, most U.S. forces leave Afghanistan next year, about the U.S. doing Pakistan's dirty work for basically. So as Professors Fair and Swift said, we're basically doing Pakistan's dirty work for taking out terrorists who don't want to go to the U.S. After U.S. forces, most of them leave after this year, and we won't be held hostage by Pakistan as much as we are currently. Do you think that that'll really start to stop, or will it basically continue?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. So my sense is it will probably continue for the simple reason that the Pakistanis are professional blackmailers. So what we've spoken about today are sort of terrorism issues, and what you've raised is the fact that we pretty much have to endure whatever they do because we have this presence in Afghanistan, and whatever they do also includes giving them $30 billion while they then use the Taliban to kill our troops. So I mean, I think I can't see you. Oh yes, I can, but I recognize your voice. So you've heard this speech before. But the real issue beyond Afghanistan is Pakistan's nuclear weapons. And this is why we are doing Pakistan's bidding. The Pakistanis know very well that sane people don't lose sleep over the random Islamist barbarian at the nuclear gate. Where these weapons are really most at risk is when there's a conflict with India and the weapons are assembled and mated and forward deployed. And to ensure that we remain ever terrified of Pakistan's inability to manage its growing arsenal, they are rapidly moving towards, I guess what we would call tactical nuclear weapons. And so this means that the Americans are going to do anything to help buttress Pakistan's internal security, because the most likely way in which these weapons would be pilfered is when they're moved out of their peacetime locations. The other way in which they can be pilfered is that the Pakistanis move these weapons around just as a part of their denial and deception, so that in case something does happen, they have even though India has a no first use policy, they still have to prepare for the eventuality of a second strike capability. And these things are not moved around in securitized convoys. They're moved around in light-skinned vehicles. The Pakistanis say it's safer that they do this. Well, that's true unless someone has given your information to a terrorist. And given that all of the high-level attacks on Pakistani military and intelligence headquarters have involved insider leaks, this is not something that we should take lightly. So my guess is that the Americans are going to be continue to be held by the nose by the Pakistanis, kind of like that thing that goes through a camel's nose, who can like lead it around, because we have this enduring fear of Pakistan's nuclear weapons generally, but then specifically in the context of these Islamist militants. And just by way of saying, the other problem with us killing Pakistan's terrorists is that it doesn't force them. There's no agreement that says we'll kill these terrorists, but you have to stop making new ones. And so it's very frustrating. Like, they're making the jihadi sausages, and here we are chopping up and tossing some of the sausages to stray dogs. But there's no requirement that they stop making the sausage to begin with.
I could just jump in on why, part of the reason why Chris and I take the position that some of the targeting in Pakistan doesn't fall within the scope of U.S. legal authorizations, or at least the AUMF. If you look at the authorization for the use of military force from September 2001, which was actually passed 12 years and 360 days ago, it relates very specifically, authorizes the use of any and all means, right? Those of you who have had my law of war class will know this spiel, so bear with me. Any and all means against the countries, notice the assumption that there's a state sponsor, actors or individuals that perpetrated the attacks or supported the perpetrators of the attacks. Right? That's a paraphrase, but it's pretty narrow. Well, the TTP Pakistan, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan didn't exist during September 11, right? Yes, there were Talibani folks, on both sides of the border, but the TTP as an organization wasn't in existence at the time. So to the extent that the U.S. government's been hitting the TTP, it's been hitting the TTP under the President's Article 2.2 authorities as Commander-in-Chief. That is a weaker level of legal authority than having the President's authority plus a congressional authorization. Right? Part of the difficulty we're having in terms of our conceptualization of what the legal boundaries of the war on terror are is when we look at the AUMF, we've had to sort of diagram back every single terrorist organization in the world to somebody who happened to know bin Laden at the time that 9/11 went down. Right? And we sort of get into a Ken Bacon, 6 degrees of separation. And I can tell you that, I'm 2 degrees of separation away from bin Laden through 3 different people, which means that everybody in this room is now 3 degrees of separation away from bin Laden. Right? Does that make you all members of the Global Salafi Jihad Syndicate? No, it doesn't. Right? So what we need when we're thinking about who our adversaries are and where and when and how we're going to confront them is a better legal framework. A legal framework that's not over-inclusive in terms of, identifying, fundamentalist Islam with violence, because it's not necessarily the same, right? But also a framework that's not under-inclusive, in terms of being a specific list of individuals like we do with sanctions programs. It's got to be something in between. And the reason we don't have a something in between is because 13 years after 9/11, 13 years after 9/11, we still have no coherent, consistent, objective criteria for defining who our adversaries are. We're still doing that 6 degrees of separation analysis back to bin Laden and his cohort 13 years ago. So when we think about these issues, it's not just a strategic issue. It's not just what Pakistan's going to do to play us while we're in Afghanistan. Some of these faults are not in our stars, but in ourselves, and in our inability to really define who the adversary is and what kind of war we're embarking on. That's something that's going to be absolutely crucial for us in light of the President's speech last night.
Yes.
So you've all clearly talked about being more discriminating and how we choose targets at this point. So I'm just wondering if you think there's any value in, as opposed to attempting decapitation or just some sort of getting rid of middle management writ large, if you think utilizing some form of systems theory to target particular individuals who are functioning as nodes within terrorist groups would be useful?
You guys went to Chicago, right? You guys can do the quantitative stuff.
Yes would be the answer, but you need a remarkable level of data to make that work. Right? You really need to understand, to be able to map the adversary network in a way that, even in hindsight, actually is quite difficult. Part of the problem with this is there are both formal and informal ties. So you could say this person has this organizational relationship with this person, and this other person does not. But by the way, person number 3 fought together with person number 1. And person number 2 and person number 3, they have cousins who grew up in the same neighborhood. And so that sort of informal network and information sharing can be tremendously important for these structures, especially clandestine structures. So notionally, sure. And I'm a believer in trying to use these tools to kind of give a bit more rigor to some of the more, I think he should be should be target sort of analysis. But we shouldn't count too much because for them to work truly effective with requires data we often lack.
One thing on the data, in my methods class, there's always some student that wants to do this. And you can't tell a student no, but you can say, I'm going to strongly discourage you from that for one reason. For you to be able to measure efficacy, you actually have to know who we killed, right? And we don't know that. We don't know who we killed. And not only do we have to know just some nominal name, we have to know a lot about who that person was within the organization, what did they do. And then that allows you to figure out what your appropriate DV should be. There's a paper that a scholar did, Patrick Johnson, very admirable attempt. But his problem is he can only look at correlations between drone strikes and incidents of violence. But without, for example, I would say one thing that you should be able to do if we knew who the fellows were that we were killing, we should see a correlation with sectarian violence in Pakistan, right? Because most of the people we're killing in the TTP have very strong connections to the LEJ and SSP. So you have to know who it is that we're killing. You have to have quite a bit of an idea about what role they had in that organization. And you have to have basically a pathway, an explanatory pathway of how their demise should have some effect on violence. And then you have to sort of think about, well, what's the genuine geographical scope of that effect? How is it that killing someone in Miramshah could actually make Lahore safer, or Gujranwala safer, or Karachi safer? And then you also have to think about timelines, right? Because some of these attacks are planned with a very long time horizon. Some of the sectarian attacks will be planned per the calendar, like Shia processions. So if there were to be some time available, should there be some time horizon when we're going to know who these people are in an unclassed way and piece together these things, I'm actually optimistic that we do have the data and we do have the quantitative skills to see if there is efficacy. But without knowing who we killed and who they were to these various organizations, that will be very difficult to answer for the policy relevant future, if ever.
As a non-quantitative person and somebody who's more of an empiricist on the PhD side, and as somebody who deals with witnesses who lie to me on a pretty regular basis, one of the beautiful things about being a lawyer is you get to go all around the world and people will lie to you in different languages. I would recommend that when we're thinking about systems level analysis, it's the system that matters is the society in which our adversary lives. And the only way to understand that society is to jump into it and swim in it. It's very comfortable for us to build perfect systems, for us to build powerful analytical models, and to manage that from a think tank or a university in London or Washington or someplace else. But I can't tell you how many of those things I've seen blow up as soon as somebody got on the ground and smelled what the dirt smells like and met the people and understood the social context for itself. The most powerful computer you have is between your 2 ears. And your ability to pick up on social cues and relationships to manage the anthropology of counterterrorism is going to be, that capacity is going to be unparalleled to any model you can build. So my recommendation would be build more relationships in the places that matter rather than building more systems and computers and programs here thousands and thousands of miles away from where the problem is.
Sorry for jumping in, but I think you have all been so incredibly convincing. But it's all within the framework, an American framework, and it's all within the framework of the war on terror. Without that framework, it doesn't make sense. And the rest of the world doesn't live within that framework of the war on terror. They don't believe that it should exist, that it rightfully exists, and they frankly think it's a bad idea, regardless of the tools involved. And then drones and the mystique of the technology adds a little extra twist to that. But you talk a lot about specific contexts. It's Yemen, it's Pakistan, and I would say within the war on terror, those are actually just operational theaters. So we never can speak about strategy in Yemen, really. It's just about tactics, possibly operational art within each of those contexts. When we speak about strategy, and I would even take it to sort of a grand strategic level and say the source of American power and security in the world isn't just based on its military capabilities. It's based on a perception of legitimacy of leadership on the global scene as well. So that's where I think there should be a little bit of a debate as well. And that means engaging the global community. And quite frankly, a discussion about Fifth Amendment and is it legal to kill American citizens, it's so offensive to the rest of the world that is the debate about drones. To the rest of the world, that is sort of, they don't get it. This is wrong. The war on terror is wrong, and drone strikes is by definition also wrong because the context is wrong. And they couldn't, the rest of the global community also cannot care less about whether it's effective or not, or obviously not legal from an American perspective. They talk about what you slightly dismissed there, Christopher, the feeling. That's all that matters. There's a feeling that this is the wrong way to police the world. And as long as that feeling grows, the perception of American legitimacy of leadership is decreasing. And that means losing the grand strategic game of maximizing US power and security in the world.
And then I wanted also to...
Sure. Perceptions of legitimacy of leadership and are dependent on a number of things.
Yeah.
One of them, of course, is adherence with international law. One of them, of course, is the understanding that whatever response the United States takes to a given problem is sort of rationally related to the nature of that problem. I can't, I went to law school, so somewhere along the lines I lost my feelings. Probably my ethics along with it, right? But I want to draw a pretty clear distinction here. The discussion about how we feel about particular things is not terribly helpful when we get to perceptions of legitimacy and leadership. And here's why. How I feel, or what my ethics or morality are, those are subjective considerations. It's not to say they're not important. They're extremely important. They matter a great deal. But they're subjective. They're personalized, or they're contextualized to a particular people, place, culture. Right? If we want to find an objective standard, one that sort of everyone's agreed on and then written down in terms of what kinds of conduct is permissible and what kind of conduct is not permissible, we have to look to the law. We have to look to international law. And in the case of, in this case, the international law that matters is the United Nations Charter, which determines when it is legitimate or not legitimate to enter into armed conflict, and the Geneva Conventions, which govern the conduct of armed conflict once you've gotten into it. Right? So to the extent that the United States is violating the UN Charter or the Geneva Conventions in its prosecution of the war on terror, I think you have a very legitimate concern, Robert, about the perceptions of legitimacy of US leadership. And to the extent that I've been critical of this administration and the past administrations, it's been in those areas where they fudged it instead of making it clear for the global public. They don't necessarily need to agree, they just need to understand how we're applying the standard that everyone's agreed to. But if I go down and I look, say, at Yemen, for example, well, you don't have a sovereignty violation in Yemen. You don't have an Article 24 or 27 violation of the UN Charter because the Yemeni government has asked the United States government to come in and help. The way this works out is, if you put anything into your neighbor's property, even if you throw a baseball across the property line, that's trespassing, right? Same thing if you lob a cruise missile in. But if your neighbor's house is burning and they ask you to come over and get the dog out, right, they ask you to come over and help put out the fire, that's not trespassing anymore, right? That falls within, in the UN parlance, Article 51, individual and collective self-defense. A sovereign can decide to ask for help. So as long as the sovereign is asking for help, and President Hadi from Yemen a year and a half ago stood up at the Woodrow Wilson Center and said, please, for the love of God, send more drones. That's pretty clear to me on a sovereignty level. Next level down, are we comporting ourselves in a fashion that's consistent with the Geneva Conventions, with the laws and customs of jus in bello, law in war? Well, there are 4 big principles there. The first is need, necessity. Is it a military target? Is there a need to use the kind of force that you're using? The second is proportionality. Are you overwhelming it? Or are you doing what needs to be done to solve the problem? The third is distinction. Are you doing your best to distinguish between civilians and combatants when you target? And the fourth is humanity. Are you causing unnecessary cruelty by virtue of the instruments you're using? Now, I'd say that we've done a lousy job of discrimination in some of these theaters, in part because our intel's bad. But in terms of all of the other elements, I'm relatively satisfied that U.S. conduct has comported with the Geneva Conventions. So when we get to this whole questions of perceptions of legitimacy of leadership, I think they're crucial. But I think we need to have that conversation in the United States and in an international basis on an objective foundation based on the agreements and standards that everyone has reached across the entire world, and not based on our subjective interpretation or understanding of what the ethics of morality of a particular situation might be. I realize that's an unsatisfactory answer, and probably one that would get me thrown out of my own faculty back in Europe, but it's nonetheless the best answer I can give you in terms of balancing the need to protect a society with the need to preserve the values on which that society is built. And it's not just U.S. society, it's international society, and the way that we write those values into the source code is through international law.
All right, so I'm going to do something I don't ever do, and I'm going to disagree with them. Well, and the reason is, it comes, well, so let me first say, I actually find myself very sympathetic to you. My problem as a citizen is that we don't know who we're killing. It is true that the House and the Senate intelligence committees have access. They probably have more oversight of the program than most people probably appreciate. But I don't feel like we as a country have had a discussion about who we're killing and to what effect. That in Pakistan in the last several years, we've been mostly killing terrorists who have no immediate harm to us, raises for me several questions. Not only that, we don't even know who the terrorists, alleged terrorists, are that we've killed, because these are in signature strikes. They're not in personality strikes. So even the government concedes that we don't know the identities of the people that we've killed. So I don't know how it is that you're comfortable saying that we've satisfied 3 of those 4 things.
I did say that I was uncomfortable with our lousy intel, and signature strikes are an area where the lack of good intel really is implicated.
But all the other
disturbing
things, for
areas.
example, I think not knowing who killed makes me feel uncomfortable that I can satisfy the other 3 criteria that you identified. But let me also, having laid that aside, so I've got big, I just don't understand how it is that signature strikes are legal. But then I'm going to turn it around and think, so, okay, so from the point of view, are these strikes in Pakistan facilitating my immediate security as an American? I'm going to say, I think the answer is no. There's no evidence that any of these people that we've killed had any intention of doing things that would immediately affect our interest. Then I have to go to the second level. Is it in the interest of international security that we are killing people whose aim it is to overthrow a state that has nuclear weapons? Okay, then I have to throw a big question mark, because that's a public good. And by the way, the Pakistanis own the airspace. So the idea that they're not facilitating this is complete hogwash. There is a civil military issue, because the civilians don't control these levers of policy, so we're basically exploiting the civil military gaps. But we are clearly doing some kind of a public good if these are the people that we're killing and this is the reason why we're doing it. Then there's a third issue, and this is actually, I would, like many liberals, and I am one, despite you perhaps view the contrary, I used to be a drone foe. For many of the reasons that liberals are drone foes, until I was in Peshawar, and I met people from Waziristan, and they told me what their experience was. I learned, and that was for me transformative, because then I realized that there's this whole set of people, like the people you met in Yemen, whose voices we're never going to hear because the human rights community obfuscates their voices. They know they exist, but they muffle them because they're inconvenient. In Waziristan, what I learned is that they call the drones arbabil. And arbabil, these little black stones that, the arbabil are these birds that drop stones upon this lushkar of this army of elephants that was attacking the Kaaba in Mecca. That is a very powerful image. And so I say to myself, at relatively low cost, we're actually providing this public good. I'm not going to speak to Yemen, I'm just talking about Pakistan. And essentially by doing nothing, we are, I would argue, creating a human rights problem, right? These are people whose own government can't protect them and won't protect them, and for its own strategic reasons won't reform the legal structure under which they live. And Pakistanis primarily benefit from this program. So I find myself deeply, deeply conflicted. I don't like how we've managed this domestically with respect to our own law. I don't feel comfortable that we're still killing people with the AUMF. I don't feel comfortable that we're using the AUMF to kill people in groups that didn't exist then. I'd like there to be a national discussion and a reauthorization and a redefinition of who the enemy is. And I'd like there to be more transparency about who we killed. I think we need to know who these people were that we have targeted and with what consequences. So I find myself really in between your positions. I'm sympathetic to both of you, but what I do find is that these signature strikes, they are a pox upon everything that we've tried to do.
Signature strikes are more okay in some contexts and less okay in others.
But it depends on who gets to make that judgment. And I don't feel comfortable delegating that judgment to a star chamber.
What makes it okay is the question of military necessity, which means that in a theater like Iraq or Afghanistan, they say that the amount of space that the Geneva Conventions will give you to engage in that kind of operation is going to be much broader because you're engaged in that operation for the purposes of force protection. In a context like Yemen or Pakistan, that spectrum is going to be much narrower, and there's going to be a much higher emphasis on exactly the kind of discrimination that you're focused on.
Well, I'm only talking about Pakistan, I'm not talking about Iraq.
And I'm talking about the global structure and the principles that the law and customs of war create, both in terms of restraint, but also in terms of what they will allow, assuming you can meet the right criteria.
I just have
Professor has a follow-up.
very brief. First of all, the perception of legitimacy is always subjective. It can never be objective. So regardless of, and secondly,
You have no solution.
yeah, I know, but I'm just highlighting the rest of the world's view of this debate beyond the.
Except by the rest of the world, I mean, I feel like we say, you know, Europe generates 2/3 of the world's public opinion. Because there's a critique of the United States in much of the world that is, it's not actually acting strongly enough. Right? I mean, there's critique in Asia that the United States is withdrawing from Asia, that China is running rampant. There's a critique in eastern parts of Europe that the United States is not standing up to the Russians. There's certainly a critique in the Middle East, which I know more about, which is that the United States has been withdrawing from the region, and as a result, bad actors have gone amok. You could disagree with that critique, but I think the legitimacy in enrollment with international law is a very European critique, and it's not one that is necessarily, I would say, better or worse as a result. But I think the critiques get very different. In the Middle East, the critique is interwoven with conspiracy theories, right? So you have kind of these, there's a good article in the paper today about Iranians basically agreeing almost unanimously that the Islamic State is a U.S. creation, right? So it's very hard in many parts of the world to kind of have these discussions in a nuanced way.
Right. So my go-to is usually Africa, where I lived and taught, and so I pick up. That's where I picked up the smell of the dirt, so to speak, and the view of American policy beyond my Europeanness. But the second thing I wanted to say is that the legal argument also needs to match the strategic political argument. And that's where you get into a hypocrisy problem when you say, well, it's legal because Yemen asked us to. Now, if you then in the second sentence say, we have to intervene in Yemen because it threatens our national security, no one in the world will believe that it's done for the purpose of Yemen. It will, and of course it's not, right? But still, that gap is problematic to the subjective perception of legitimacy.
Notice I posed 3 elements in the framework. The first threshold question is it legal?
Yeah.
The second question is it effective? Right? And is both the short-term operational effectiveness and the long-term strategic effectiveness. And the third question, it's the most subjective of the 3 questions in my framework, is it wise? My preference is don't pull the trigger unless you can answer yes to all 3 of those questions and the elements under it. I don't want to see force used unnecessarily. And I want decision makers and future decision makers walking through each of the elements in that process before they decide to pull the trigger. But if they walk through those things and they can find that all three of those things hold together, then as far as I'm concerned, they've allied ways, means, and ends with the international objective consensus about what appropriate conduct in war is. Sometimes you have to fight. Some things are worth fighting for. I tend to think that fighting for the voiceless is something that, is worth doing, and I know you do too at a deep level. So the question is, how do we get there? How do we be good stewards of both the law and the strategy? And if we assume that law and strategy are at odds with one another, or we assume that there's no, because everything's subjective and relative, there can be no consensus, we've stopped the discussion before we can even have it.
Well, with that, it is 1:30, and I'd ask everybody, I think you'll all agree that what we've heard today is extremely insightful and valuable, and I hope all of you, the students, will take on these issues in your studies in the next year or two, however long you're here. So please join me in giving a round of applause.